One of the main aims of formal English language teaching in educational institutions to students who study English as a second language or as a foreign language or as an additional language is to enable them to use English effectively or to communicate in English effectively. Despite um, studying English is in the ESL context or EFL or EAL context, many students find it difficult to communicate effectively in the language. So, why is it that students, despite being instructed in the formal ESL context, are unable to communicate effectively in English? This is a question that we will briefly respond to in this presentation. So first of all, what generally is communication is? Communication basically is exchange or sharing of information, ideas, thoughts, feelings, facts, etc. Um, Generally, communication has these two main types: the verbal communication, which is the use of language, written or spoken, for communication, and the non-verbal communication, which is the use of body language, gestures, or facial expressions, etc. The ESL EFL communication basically is communication using English as a second language or as an additional language, or it is also termed as, in many cases, where English is taught as a foreign language. Now, why is it that English is taught in the ESL, EFL, or EAL context? It is because of its importance is language of international communication, globalization, uh, also in many in the context of many countries, the English language has a historical importance or roots, especially the colonial past of those countries where the language has taken root as a result of especially of the British rule over there in the past. Also, English um, is an important and a very significant source of knowledge, scholarship, and in the modern era, a source of the knowledge related to science and technology. Besides this, it has market value in terms of the ability of this language to help the learners in terms of finding good jobs, in terms of involving in businesses beyond national or regional boundaries. The current modern era has the internet and IT revolution, and again, English language plays a highly important role in terms of our access to the knowledge that and the information and the communication that takes place through the internet. And so the IT revolution has played an important role in terms of substantiating and increasing the importance of English language. And lastly, its academic value, because it has become a store of international academic knowledge. Its literary role as well, because it's a store of international literature, in many cases original literature, in other cases literature that has been translated into this common lingua franca from different languages. Then the cultural and professional value that this language has. And so, as a result of this immense importance of this international language, generally this is now taught almost in a majority of the countries as a school and college subject, and in many cases, the teaching of English begins at the primary school level and continues throughout to the university. And so, because of these important points, it is a highly important language to learn. Now, what are the general problems that students uh, face in the English language communication? So, as I said in the beginning, communication, especially the verbal form of communication, has these four important aspects: the listening part of it, the speaking, reading, and writing part of the communication, of the language learning skills. Now, students face problems in terms of having expertise in terms of language, listening and speaking, reading and writing, mainly because of the issues in terms of the teaching uh, of English in the ESL, EFL, EAL context, and also in terms of the evaluation, in the way the language learning is actually evaluated. So there are there are problems related to the teaching of English or the instruction of English in educational institutions, and also in terms of the evaluation. So as we know that in many cases, teaching is generally done with a view to the process of evaluation. So the evaluation process impacts the instruction or teaching of language. In many cases, the evaluation process focuses on generally on rote memorization or and specifically on the writing aspect of the language and ignores other aspects such as the listening, speaking, and reading skills. And so that is why uh, the teaching process then focuses on preparing students for examinations or evaluations. And so we can see that there is kind of deficiency in terms of the holistic way in which English should be taught. So the first skill that is very important for effective language learning, including English language learning, is listening. Generally, it has been observed, and research also indicates that there is almost a negligible exposure of students to this aspect of language in the EFL, ESL, or EL context in the educational institutions, both in terms of their learning and the teaching, and also in terms of evaluation. Then the other important active component of language learning or skill is the speaking skill. Again, almost negligible exposure is given to students to this aspect of language, that is the learning of speaking or the practice of speaking. So generally in most ESL, EFL context, students rarely get an opportunity to speak the language or to use this language in practice for active communication. And then reading. So there is some exposure to reading generally in the ESL context, but this reading is very limited. Generally, it is restricted to the prescribed textbooks. And again, in many cases, in a classroom situation, it is the teacher who reads out aloud, and generally the students just listen, perhaps not to very standard pronunciation or articulation of the language. And so the students generally remain silent listeners. And then for practice, some of the bright students are then asked to read aloud and the other listen. So as a result, the reading there is limited exposure to reading, and that has an impact on the overall uh, language learning and communication skills of the students. Lastly, the writing. So again, there is almost no practice, no practical activities, no practical involvement of the students in actual creative and independent writing. Generally, again, what happens is that the teachers write things for them, or even in some cases, the teachers themselves copy those pieces of writing, such as essays or other compositions such as applications or stories or things like that. So they copy those from other sources, and then the students actually get a copy of the copy, and then they copy those or memorize those pieces and reproduce those in exams. And so as a result, there is almost negligible exposure to the writing of English as well in the educational context. So overall, we can see that all the four important aspects of language do not get the kind of attention that is needed for learning English for better and more effective communication. Listening and speaking get maybe some exposure, listening and reading, but the more active aspects of the four language skills, that is speaking and writing, these are almost entirely neglected in the educational context in the ESL and EFL, or English as an additional language context. And so, in order to improve students' communication and also perhaps teachers' communication, um, in order to give them better command on the use of English for effective communication, there is need for restructuring of the both the instructional aspects of English and also the evaluation of the English language